There have been few other moments in modern history preserved in time as is the Edwardian era and its most iconic symbol, RMS Titanic. Following the death of Queen Victoria and the succession of her son, King Edward VII, in 1901, with the new century advanced a new extravagance, marked by immense financial gains among the wealthy and the continuing separation of class. The temperament of this developing period was embodied in RMS Titanic. Historians now point to the Titanic Disaster as the moment when the Edwardian era ended. One warm summer afternoon in 1907 London, two of the world's wealthiest men, Lord Peary and Bruce Ismay, met to discuss a project as enormous as the appetites of their time.
A ship the size of the Titanic would only have been possible in the beginning of the 1900s. It was a time period when the economies of the major countries in the world were doing very, very well. Technological advances had been progressing at a rapid rate. Vessel construction technology had enabled companies to start building vessels over 600 feet in length, about 1900. And really, steel shipbuilding was starting to come into its own. Earlier steel shipbuilding techniques in the 1890s, 1900 had produced brittle steel that couldn't stand up to many of the stresses that larger vessels would encounter. But they had recently overcome those barriers in the steel manufacturing process. Money was overflowing in the economy. The immensely wealthy were being minted weekly, new millionaires, multimillionaires at that time. And so there was a lot of demand for bigger, better, more opulent vessels.
So in the 1900s, you got the Cunard Line, who's really has a large portion of the freight of people going back and forth from America and Europe. White Star Line is trying to come up with some way to compete with the Cunard Line. And so they come up with this concept of three sister ships. They come up with the idea of the Olympic, the Titanic, and what turns out to be the Britannic. Before the Titanic sinks, it was going to be called the Gigantic. We all kind of see the bad idea of that name, so they changed it to Britannic, which is a safer name. And Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland, they, build the Olympic, and before the Olympics even done, they start building the Titanic right next to it. And, the two, beautiful sister ships getting built next to each other they're amazing.
The whole idea of Titanic, it came about with J.P. Morgan bought White Star Line. He consolidated a bunch of companies together. And what he did was he was thinking of making a superior cruise line. I mean, that's what it was. He was doing what they do now, and they'd start picking at the market and dominating. He picked up some of the best people to do the work on this ship. Their whole idea was to build the biggest, be the biggest, and basically dominate the market. I mean, every facet they tried to take care of their passengers.
Titanic's sheer size mandated a huge metal framework to be constructed to accommodate her bulk. The Harland and Wolff shipyard was the largest in the world at the time. The Titanic would occupy the space normally used to build 3 average ships.
So part of what people believe in the Titanic is that there was a problem with the rivets on board the Titanic. Back in 1909, there are 2 types of rivets. There are actually more than 2, but 2 that the Titanic uses, Rivet 3 and Rivet 4. Now, Rivet 3 is considered the best, and Rivet 4 is considered the best rivet. It's a higher quality rivet. The 4 has less slag in it, which makes it a stronger rivet. Now, the Rivet 3 that they used has actually a higher content of iron in it and less of a steel content. The steel makes it stronger. So they had some of the 4 with the steel in it that they used in certain regions on the ship, and then they had other regions like the bow and the stern that they used the 3 on because they didn't think there'd be as much stress on the stern or on the bow, because that's not where the stress line of the ship lies. That's not where it's going to crack or have any issues, so that they use the weaker ones in the front and the back, and they think that this will be okay.
How many skilled riveters do you have at this time? I mean, you're putting in 3 million. I don't know how many riveters they had, but this is a high-skilled process at that time. So there's some questions in that area also. Again, White Star, again, with these rivets, took a lower class rivet. They cut some corners here, just like they did with the lifeboats.
Steel manufacturing in the United States had gone through a number of phases, particularly with respect to maritime metallurgy. In the 1890s, there were a number of early vessels that broke in half because the steel was so brittle. But to push vessels beyond about 600 feet, they needed another revolution in maritime steel metallurgy, and one occurred between 1900 and 1910.
But that harkens back to the builders again, probably the owners. Let's do it cheaper. We're never going to have a problem with this ship. So let's cut corners. And they could get away with it in those days. They paid the price for, imagine that, cheap rivets.
The fables and folklore surrounding the great ship began long before it went into the water. Stories, true and imagined, began to surround Titanic from before the beginning.
I think it comes back way back when they started building the ship. There was actually a man that was entombed in Titanic. People don't realize that they entombed him when they were doing the hot rivets on the ship. He was in Titanic and they couldn't get him out. They heard the voices and they couldn't get him out.
That narrative, plus the often told myth that a worker painted "We defy God to sink her" on Titanic's stern, are some of the sea stories inspired by Titanic.
Well, the Titanic was the first big adventure at sea where we launched the ship on her maiden voyage of her extreme size. The passenger list, so many famous people went down with that ship at one time. How can you lose all these people? And then, of course, the myths start, the legends. They come out of anywhere. Somebody down in the engine room, one of the stokers, could come up with a story and make himself the hero of what happened down in the engine room, and it makes for a good story.
Back when the Titanic was getting ready to sail, the SS New York was in port in Southampton, and Titanic's getting ready to leave, and the big fanfare and everything, and Titanic's leaving the dock, and the power of the ship was so big, the power of the triple screw propellers pulling away from the dock actually sucked the New York from its moorings. So it was sucking it into Titanic, and they realized it. So they had to, Captain Smith had to make a split-second decision and move the ship. So he decided to move the ship faster so that the New York wouldn't slam into the side of the hull of Titanic.
And then as she's sailing, there's a coal fire. There's a fire in the bunkers while the ship is sailing for the first 4 days it's out to sea.
One concept that will forever be tied to Titanic is that she was promoted as unsinkable.
Okay, the Titanic was considered to be an unsinkable ship. And the purpose behind this is they put in watertight, as they called it at that time, watertight compartments, when in actuality they weren't. They were only watertight if the water went up to a certain distance. In this case, when the vessel hit the iceberg and started to take on water, the water basically, kind of like a ice cube tray, the water ran over from one compartment to the next compartment and the next compartment. Even though the Titanic had huge pumps on it, and those pumps were working, during the process of it sinking, it kept it up longer than it would have or normally have done.
When the Shipbuilder magazine published an article about this ship has watertight doors and it's superior built and it's the biggest, and There was nothing around at the time that could even compare to Titanic. The watertight doors are one thing that totally sealed the deal for people that were going to sail. Wow, we're going to go on a ship that's unsinkable.
So everybody knows it's unsinkable. And nobody thinks that even when the ship is sinking, that it's actually going down. There are some passengers that think this is going to be some kind of a drill. This is some kind of a publicity stunt that the White Star Line is trying to portray to show that, oh, it's an unsinkable ship.
There was rumors that they were playing with pension and stuff with him to make him, force him to do what he was doing. I mean, that was what the rumor was. Do this or we'll hold pension from you. And back then they didn't, there was not like it is now.
Titanic's charted course would take her into known ice fields. Captain Smith was aware of this and would not be surprised when he was notified of iceberg reports, and also growlers, or smaller pieces of ice which had been broken away and could be harder to see.
The wireless operators aboard the Titanic worked for the Marconi Telegraph Company, not for the ship company. So they just had to take care of all the telegrams that the passengers were sending ahead. So when the ice reports started coming in, they ignored them because it wasn't top priority. That, of course, has all changed over the years.
Way back when Captain Smith was he was pressed into taking the Titanic up to full speed. Well, not really full speed, but 23 knots, which is really fast going through an ice field. They kept getting warnings after warning that there was icebergs in their area. As a matter of fact, one of the ships, the Marconi operator sent them a message from one of the ships that said that there was icebergs miles ahead of them, which they were already in the middle of the icebergs. They were in the middle of it. So there's a lot of factors with the ship that Captain Smith was freewheeling the ship, basically, passing notes to passengers saying, we're not going to need this. There's icebergs ahead, but we're on the biggest and the best ship ever, so there's no need to worry.
There are several individuals on board the White Star Line Titanic who are not employed by the White Star Line. The Marconi operators, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, are two individuals who are getting paid to send transmissions from the millionaires to anybody and everybody that they want to. Every transmission they sent, they get paid for. So those are really their priority. I hate to say that, but that is their priority because they're getting paid for it. They're not getting paid to send ice warnings or send other transmissions from White Star Line to White Star Line or from White Star Line to other vessels.
What they decided to do to compensate for this is to steer somewhat south. They figured that if they got far enough south, they'd be to the edge of the iceberg pack and they would encounter less of a chance of hitting anything. They did that in lieu of checking down their speed, which probably would have been more prudent.
I think there was quite a few things in Captain Smith's head. The ship is new. It's taunted as the Unsinkable. We have the architect on here. There's no need to worry about anything. We're on the biggest and best.
Radio in 1912, especially seagoing radio, was not considered, I don't believe was considered as that important. It was great for transmitting data on where I am and where should I go next to pick up more cargo or that type of thing. It was not necessarily a safety device the way it is today.
On the evening of April 14th, 1912, Captain Smith dined with some of the first-class passengers. At that same time, Harold Bride was busy transmitting and receiving messages in the Marconi telegraph office, and First Officer William Murdoch was on duty at the bridge.
On April 14th, there are 6 different ice warnings that are sent to Titanic through the Marconi, and the 2 operators don't send all of these up to the bridge. They're too busy getting paid to send first-class transmissions, and they're too busy to even take the time to send any of the 6 up. We know that two of the six did not make it up there. One of the 6, we believe, Captain Smith, actually hands to a millionaire in one of the first-class lounges as a joke, saying, "There are ice warnings. We don't need to worry about this, though. So here, you can keep this." So we know that of the 6 didn't make it.
The Marconi Company itself, because it was its own entity, Marconi and White Star Line were not the same company. So Marconi, they were a business. So basically, they were sending messages ship to shore from the millionaires, the Strausses, and whoever was sending messages back and forth to the States, telling them that they were going to come home at this time. Marconi officers were getting messages after messages that there was icebergs dead ahead. Junior Officer Bride went up to the bridge, across the hall to the bridge, and gave a message to Officer Murdoch that there was icebergs dead ahead. And Murdoch just put him aside and said, we're not going to need anything to do with that.
The vessel left England. I don't know if it was an oversight or not. They did not carry binoculars. So now you've got 2 gentlemen up in the crow's nest, let's call it, or the lookout. They're in iceberg area, and they did put people out to watch for this. And these guys are using their common eyesight rather than binoculars.
It was a clear night, moonless, which was a big factor, because you didn't have the moon reflecting off the iceberg. There was no sea rolling at all. And normally, especially in salt water, you get some effervescence. You can see the sparks in the water when it splashes. So you would have seen a line of waves hitting this iceberg and reflecting back. With a dead calm, you wouldn't even see that. Until all of a sudden, up looms this big piece of ice.
They're spending more time and more time sending the million transmissions they have from the first-class passengers and spending less and less time worrying about the ice warnings. They get an ice warning from the California late in the evening, and the operators in Titanic's Marconi spike him back and say, "I don't have time for this. I've got other more important things to do." So California retires for the night and turns off their Marconi.
As they're up in the crow's nest looking out at the iceberg, a lot of people don't know that 90% of the iceberg's underwater. So it's bigger underwater. It looks, an iceberg is a certain size up top, but underwater there's quite a bit. As they were looking out at the iceberg, they saw a certain size iceberg, but it could have been triple the size under the water. With no binoculars, at the time when they're pulling up this, it wasn't enough time.
When they did finally see the iceberg that night approaching the ship, it was far too late. It was a flat calm, and so it didn't provide the kind of contrast that you would normally be able to get in seeing an iceberg in the distance.
So that night, you've got 2 guys in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, manning the watch. It's a 2-hour watch that they man. They don't have any binoculars because in the hustle and bustle of getting Titanic ready, the binoculars are left behind. Couple that with the fact that it's a moonless night. It is a very calm sea, so that there's no slapping on the base of the iceberg with the water. The slapping on the base of the iceberg creates a ring of foam around it, making it easier to see. So at about 11:40, they see the iceberg, and they immediately radio the officers at the helm and tell them, "Iceberg dead ahead." And in 37 seconds, the Titanic hits the iceberg. That's the amount of time that they had to respond. And unfortunately, we know that about 75% of icebergs are below water. Another thing about this iceberg is, in listening to eyewitness testimony, they think it has recently flipped, which means the iceberg was actually darker and making it harder to see, because when it's underwater, it actually it shades it a little more, so it's not as white and not as bright as a lot of the other icebergs would have been. So Murdoch immediately responds by saying, "We need to steer around this iceberg." And in doing that, he turns the ship into the side of the iceberg, and the ship scrapes the side of Titanic, and unfortunately does enough damage to doom the ship.
As they came up, they spotted the iceberg. They did contact the pilot house immediately. And in the process, they did a full astern, hard to port turn, which would have slowed the vessel down and would have slowed that turn down. If they would have continued full speed and made their turn, there probably would have been much less of a glancing blow on the iceberg, or even maybe a miss.
High above, in the crow's nest, lookout Archie Jewell said to his colleague that, as he worded it, he could smell an iceberg nearby. At 11:39, his scent was vindicated when his fellow lookout, Frederick Fleet, saw an iceberg dead ahead of the ship. Fleet rang the bell 3 times, called the bridge, and told them there was an iceberg immediately dead ahead. Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. Sunday, April 14, 1912.
So you can imagine with an 800-foot ship, how long it would take for her to turn. And then, of course, how much time did they have? How far were from the iceberg when they actually saw it? Stop the engines. She's still going forward until they finally can bite in. But it was too late.
So Murdoch's split-second decision to actually try and go around the iceberg and actually turn full astern is a bad decision, because the ship takes too long to stop, and then to start the engines up to go full reverse. He probably would have been better off trying to just go forward and continue on their path and almost go around it. Now the iceberg scrapes against the side of the ship, and at the time we thought it was a huge gash that was gutted into the Titanic. It turns out that there are no more than 6 gashes in the Titanic, totaling about 12 to 13 square feet of holes in the ship. And enough of these gashes are far enough down the Titanic that it fractures 5 of the watertight compartment doors, and it floods enough of the ship that it can't withstand this, and it inevitably sinks.
As the Titanic hits the iceberg, Officer Murdoch calls down to, or Captain Smith calls up and says, "What was that?" He says, "We had a problem. We hit an iceberg, we think." So Captain Smith rushes and gets his clothes on and comes up to the bridge. In the meantime, Murdoch decides to close the watertight doors. So he calls down, he hits the doors close. Captain Smith starts getting an idea that maybe he should send somebody down there, so he sends down Officer Lowe to the lower decks of Titanic. He goes down to the lower decks of Titanic and sees nothing. So he comes back and gives them a report that there's no water. We're fine. The watertight doors are working. A little time later, they get a call from the mailroom, and the mailroom is starting to fill up with water. They're the first ones to see that. So the mailroom was the first compartment that was going to get water.
But when she turned to port and got the glancing blow from the iceberg, the hull couldn't take it. And the plates being riveted together began to part because of the extreme pressure of the ice against the hull. Start popping the rivets. Well, that, of course, opened her up. She had what they called watertight bulkheads, but not watertight as we know today. They had walls, but they didn't go to the overhead. They weren't sealed. They were open at the top because there's no way the water ever would have got that high. However, she got hit with the glancing blow, and it opened up 5 of these watertight so-called compartments. So she started to flood pretty quick. Well, when she started to go down, the water started pouring over one bulkhead into the next watertight bulkhead, which made her to list more, and that went into the 6, and she became then unstable, and she was on her way down.
The rivets, when it did hit the iceberg, popped out of place. Some of them might have sheared off. And in recent years, they've done testing on the rivets to figure out, well, what quality rivets were there too much slag in some of these rivets. And I believe recently there were 48 that were tested by there was a lab that tested the 48, and they found that they were definitely, the ones in the bow were of a lower quality, and definitely part of the reason why the Titanic might have popped some of these rivets and opened up.
The other facet to this is the rivets. There's different classes of rivets, and within the engineering, and this vessel was built with some of the top engineers in the country at the time, the company took a less expensive rivet. And at the same time, the Olympia is being built in the berth next to it, and you've got 3 million rivets going into this vessel. And there's probably a shortage as they're trying to adjust this information back and forth with passing rivets between the two different vessels. At the same time, how many skilled riveters do you have at this time? I mean, you're putting in 3 million. I don't know how many riveters they had, but this is a high-skilled process at that time. So there's some questions in that area also.
For nearly a century to follow, the belief was that Titanic had been ripped open by the iceberg. Now, with state-of-the-art technology, further investigation of the wreck has proven the steel plate construction of the ship was pulled off its rivets, allowing seawater to pour into the hull.
The metal they used is the plate. I mean, they could be inferior too. I mean, there's all kinds of things that it was just a domino. It was a domino effect of product that wasn't the best to use.
So the Titanic has these 16 watertight compartment doors. And unfortunately, they weren't designed to actually have a cap on the top. So as soon as one gets filled up, it cascades into the next compartment. And then it spills into the next compartment. Kind of almost like filling up an ice tray. You fill up an ice tray with water, and as it fills up in one, it pours over into the next one. And it pours over into the next one, because we know the Titanic starts getting pulled down more from the weight of the water in the top of the ship, in the front of the ship.
Now, at the time the Titanic was lost, they were heavily reinforcing the bows of those vessels because they were running through ice oftentimes. They wanted to make sure that they were like a battering ram up front. Had the Titanic hit that iceberg head on, she probably would have stayed afloat, because her watertight bulkhead in front probably would have kept her from filling up.
So Captain Smith decides that they need to stop the ship, because if they continue to move forward, the water will actually spill into the ship at a quicker rate. Once they finally stop, the water seems to spill in a lot less, a lot slower, and they start turning on some of the pumps they have to try and evacuate or remove some of the water from the ship. This helps a little bit, but it doesn't help enough because they've already taken on too much water to float for very long.
The ship's designer was sent down, Thomas Andrews, to check on the damage in Titanic. Then he realized how bad it was because he saw the water coming in. So he knew by the amount of water that was coming in that they didn't have a chance. They had hours to stay afloat. And knowing that they didn't have enough lifeboats on deck, they were doomed. Captain Smith made the order to the Marconi office to send the SOS, which basically was CQD MGY, which was come quickly danger. The ships around that got this call were shocked because it couldn't be. It couldn't be the great Titanic that they just built, the Unsinkable.
At 5 minutes after midnight, Thomas Andrews, Titanic's designer, informed Captain Smith of his estimation that the ship would sink within the next 2 hours. Captain Smith immediately ordered his chief officer to prepare the lifeboats.
The law at that time said that you had a minimum of 16, depending upon the length of the vessel, and she was the top part and the length of that order. So they could get away with 16 lifeboats, but they'd put a couple of collapsible boats. I think it was 4 collapsible boats. Figured they'd never use them.
But everyone on board, all of the senior officers, knew that they only had lifeboats for a third of the people on board. And so it was very clear to everyone that there was going to be a large fatality, especially when they realized that there were no ships answering their SOS that were very close by.
The regulations in 1912 don't allow or don't require the White Star Line to have enough lifeboats for everybody, whether that be an omen or not. The original designs actually called for 62 lifeboats, cut back to 32 to make more deck space, cut back to 16 lifeboats.
The Titanic had 3,560 life jackets, enough for every soul on board. She had 14 main lifeboats that could hold 65 people, 2 smaller sea boats that held 40 occupants, and 4 collapsible boats, which, once erected, accommodated 47 additional people. There were enough lifeboats to save 1,178 passengers. Even throughout the very best of scenarios, 1,029 souls on board would still be doomed.
Captain Smith gave the orders to load the lifeboats with passengers. The ship is sinking. Women and children first, he orders. They go onto the deck and they pull off the tarps and they begin to call people into the lifeboats. Most of them were wearing life vests, but a lot weren't, because they couldn't believe it. They thought this was just a test. They were going to be on and off the ship and back on in the morning. So it wasn't sinking. They were all confident that the Titanic wasn't sinking. Until a couple of the first class passengers looked down into the third class and saw the water coming up extremely fast. They realized that they better get on some lifeboats. The lifeboats left half full, the first couple. Amazing. They probably could have filled them with 60 people in there. But they didn't fill the lifeboats.
I think fear gripped the captain, gripped a lot of the senior officers at that point, because they knew that a disaster of epic proportions was unpreventable.
So Captain Smith, realizing that the ship is going to sink, goes down to the Marconi operators, Bride and Phillips, and tells them, you need to send out distress, and you need to send it out as quickly as you can. So the two of them get cracking on the Marconi, and they send out what originally was CQD, come quickly, distress, or danger. And at some point, they turn to each other and go, well, there's this other one. It's a shorter and easier signal to send out, and it's simply an SOS. And the SOS stands for Save Our Ship, or Save Our Souls, it's believed by some, is what it actually stands for. So the two send out the signal, and they get responses from several, but the closest is the Carpathia. Carpathia is about 58 miles away at the time, and the Marconi operator is only up by chance at this point in time in the night, and he gets this because he's waiting for a response to something he sent earlier. Upon getting the SOS from Titanic, he wakes Rostreen, the captain of the Carpathia, and immediately they turn and they head in the direction of the Titanic.
As the angle of the great liner became ever more pronounced, the sober realization set in that the vessel's demise was indeed imminent. Finally, they began to board the remaining lifeboats in earnest.
The third-class passengers weren't able to congregate as much because they were all tucked in different regions of the ship. Some were in the front, some were in the bottom, some were in the back. Whereas first class, they were all together. They were all in one big area on board the ship so that they could commune. They could all be together and socialize.
In the process of getting off the vessel, we have to remember that there was a class of level of people at that time. Okay, your first class, there was 63% of the first class was saved, even though it was women and children first. A number of millionaires did lose their life on this vessel, male millionaires. Your second class, about 42% were saved. And I'm sure that in the process of loading up the lifeboats, the crew, which 23% of them survived, and third class, 25% of them, I'm sure that the process was the crew members looking at the individual and saying, this is a first class person, he's going to get on the boat. versus a steerage person. We're not going to get him on the boat because we're trying to save that lifeboat for one of the first class or second class people. So, there was this level of class within that at that time. And you've also got the captain who is letting everybody know that he's yelling at everybody to tell them, you're British, you're British. So when we look at the survival rate, we look at the Americans who were more aggressive, and they had a higher percentage of survival than the British did. Now again, the British is much more understanding of the class levels than the Americans are. That's the way Europe and England have been brought up. Their entire life was class of people. Your steerage, who were really way down there on the line, were considered not worth living. And so, I think that played a lot into the survival of the 700 plus people that survived on this vessel.
Now, part of the problem this is approximately 12:30, 12:40, it's about an hour after the ship has hit the iceberg, is a lot of the passengers don't believe the ship is going to sink. They've all read that it's unsinkable. They've all read that it's got all of these safety features. And how is it possible that we need to get into a lifeboat and get off this ship? So the first couple lifeboats that get swung out and get dropped into the freezing cold water are a fraction full. They have 12 passengers. They have 20 passengers. Maximum of 65. So they go away a third empty. And the next ones, they're loading women and children. They load in several men for oarsmen. And on one side of the ship, they actually do let some of the men get in because there aren't any passengers, any women or children to load into the lifeboats.
At 12:55 a.m., bright white distress flares were fired from high above deck, exploding loudly in the dark night sky. Such lights were visible to nearby ships.
After the rockets were fired, they saw some mystery lights out there that were possibly ships. A lot of the speculation was that they were whaling ships out there, illegally whaling, and they didn't want to come in and be found that they were doing something illegal in the ocean, so they just sailed away.
Another problem is there is a ship in the area. There's the California, which we believe was only about 20 miles from the Titanic. Now, earlier in the evening, the Marconi operator on the California had sent word to Titanic, to Phillips and Bride, the Marconi on Titanic, that there was ice right in their general area where they were heading. And Titanic's operators respond with, "We're busy, I don't have time for this," and off they go, on with sending their messages that they're getting paid for. California hangs up their wireless for the night, and then later in the evening, as the distress rockets are fired, some of the crew, some of the officers on the California see the distress rockets, and they don't do anything about it.
The tragedy of the night, I suppose, is that the Californian had her radio shut off, and that was not uncommon. The radios on ships weren't seen as being vital at that time. Ships had been sailing without telegraph for hundreds of years without any problem. The thought that one should just leave their telegraph on was not something that had been considered. So that the Californian never got the message until the next morning that the Titanic was going down nearby. The crew on the Californian did, however, spot the Titanic's fireworks in the distance and actually woke the captain up and notified him that there were fireworks on the horizon. At the time, the captain thought that it might just be a celebration of some sort and went back to sleep and said, "Let's not worry about it."
There's no doubt that they could have saved lives, the California. I mean, they could have saved a lot of lives. Being that close, 20 miles away from Titanic, there's no doubt.
So Captain Lord probably makes what is construed to be the worst decision of his career by not responding to what they see. They see the rockets, they know there's something going on, but he doesn't take the time to wake up the Marconi. He doesn't take the time to turn on the radio and send signal to figure out what is going on right 18, 20 miles away from him. So unfortunately, it's not until 5 or 6 in the morning that the Marconi operator gets on and finds out the Titanic is sinking or has already sunk at this point in time.
Captain Lord of the California was woken up during the evening because flares were seen off in the distance. He basically asked his crew what color were the flares, because he didn't know if these were communication flares or what type of flares. He did, in his defense, send out Morse code, flash Morse code, but these two vessels were probably about 20 miles apart, and flash Morse code with the Morse code gun would only go about 4 or 5 miles. At this point, he got no response. He didn't see any more flares, so basically went back to bed.
At 2 a.m., Titanic's last lifeboat was lowered to the surface of the Atlantic. Bruce Ismay boarded this lifeboat and abandoned 1,500 souls still on board his ship to their fates. Mr. Navratil handed his 2 infant boys to those in the last lifeboat, that action saving their lives.
As Titanic is sinking, the bow is filling up with water. The bow is 3/4 of the way, well, it was half the way into the sea as the stress point started giving way under the water. The bow rips loose and falls into the sea. The stern pops up, stays afloat a little bit, and passengers, I'm sure, were thinking that this ship is going to sail away. This is part of the safety. Then they start hearing explosions underwater. People have said that there was explosions, which was the air that was left inside the hull of the ship. A little time later, the stern slowly, they said that a lot of the passengers said that it just, basically they floated right off the ship as it went under.
The next morning, to do their rescue, they found that their watches had stopped around 2:10. So they anticipate, these aren't waterproof watches like we have today. They anticipate that a lot of these people jumped into the water in around that time, and so the vessel probably went down around 2:10, 2:15, whatever, and sank at that time.
After all the lifeboats had gone, the orchestra continued on in order to calm those left behind. In the great ocean liner's final moments, they played "Nearer, My God, to Thee," until they too vanished into the dark waters.
As Titanic was sinking, the bow was filled with water. A lot of the ship was filled with air. So when the bow is tipped forward and sinking, it starts pulling the ship down into the sea. As it's pulling the ship into the sea, the air starts imploding the ship as it's going down.
Captain Smith on the Titanic, there's been 3 different stories that have gone around on basically what happened with him. One is that he was washed overboard. The second one is that he took a bullet, committed suicide due to loss of the vessel. And the other one was that he headed up to one of the collapsible lifeboats. And we do know from witnesses that one of the collapsible lifeboats was rolled off into the sea.
And as the once great ship foundered, those occupying the lifeboats could hear the screams of those now on the water. Mrs. Goldsmith held her child's head to her chest to prevent him from hearing the wailing voices. The people in the lifeboats knew that if they tried to rescue the people in the water, there would be virtually hundreds attempting to climb aboard and doom them all in the process.
At about 2:15 or 2:30, a lot of the watches stopped the passengers that they found. Just the only way to explain how to be in that type of water with as cold as it was is to take your hand and put it on a piece of ice and hold it there for 10 minutes and see if you can do it. It's something that you don't even want to think about. That's horrible.
So the Carpathia is the closest one that can respond, or at least that's what we think at first. The Carpathia is about 58 miles away, and they engineer something on their ship so they can go faster than they should be going, not only because of the ice field, but because of the ability of the Carpathia itself. Now they're 58 miles away, and they actually don't get to Titanic until after 4 in the morning, the spot, the location that they got the coordinates for. Now when they get to the spot, there's nothing. At first they see nothing, and then little by little, they see the speckling of lifeboats that are in the water. And they can't believe it. They can't believe the ship is gone. They just keep looking around for where is the Titanic? Where is it sitting?
This whole process of the flares going off, the people getting in the boats, the SOS or the CDQ going out, was picked up by the Carpathia. But the Carpathia was about 60 miles away. Immediately went in the direction of where the Titanic was, but it was at least a 4-hour ride at about 15 knots to 16 knots.
One of the great tragedies of the Titanic disaster is the fact that another ship was actually quite nearby at the time, the Californian, and much investigation was held after the Titanic disaster into the failure of the Californian to respond to the disaster. SOSs, CQDs were being sent out by the Titanic. The nearest ship to actually respond was a ship called the Carpathia that was 58 miles away.
On April 18th, RMS Carpathia arrived into New York Harbor with its transfer of 706 survivors of the 2,223 souls on board Titanic. Before docking, the Carpathia lowered the Titanic's lifeboats back into the water. Crew members from the Titanic rowed the lifeboats to the White Star dock, where the ship would have made port. That was the final act of service of Titanic's crew that would ever be conducted.
So when we look at the people that were saved on board Titanic, we look at the first class passengers, about 63% saved. Second class was about 42%. Third class was about 25%, and then the number of crew was only about 23% saved. Part of that is proximity. Part of that is because the first class, well, they were up on the decks where the lifeboats were being loaded. Second class was pretty close as well. And then the third class down in steerage, well, it was hard for them to even get up on deck, not to mention the fact that the communication. A lot of third class passengers didn't speak English, so they didn't know what was going on as the ship is sinking.
It is kind of interesting that we're sitting here 100 years after the fact of Titanic sinking, and it's this big of a thing. Titanic, I think, every one of us can relate to an individual on a ridge, poor, or other that was on Titanic, and it's something about being a human. I mean, they locked people in. Third class was considered the down and dirty. You know, they didn't care about third class, so it's a shame. It's a shame that society was like that. It's Titanic is going to go on forever, I think, because it does. You go on a ship now and you do a lifeboat drill. Another thing, too, with these big ships, this is going to happen again. There's going to be something happen again because they're too big. You can't just keep making them bigger and bigger and expect nothing to happen.
We've got the two pieces of the Titanic sitting down on the bottom of the ocean, and every year it's commemorated. And every year we lose more and more of the ship. It won't be too soon that we won't recognize what's down there. It won't be too soon that the bacteria and the microorganisms will eat away at so much of her that we won't recognize the stern and the bow, and we will forever lose the Titanic to the sea.
People are fascinated by shipwrecks. They're always fascinated by shipwrecks. Here you've got a shipwreck that is 800 some feet long. It's unsinkable. It goes off on its maiden voyage, and it sinks. When it was found in 1986 by Dr. Bellert, we saw the first pictures of it. Again, you refer that to it, what it looked like above water, what it looked like underwater, and you start bringing the story together. And again, that generates more history, more interest. It just keeps coming back.
When we were at the wreck, we threw out a wreath for the passengers of the Titanic. It's emotional. Because all the kids died out there. a lot of kids that didn't have a chance. And I found a lot of toys. It's horrible.
As the Titanic rests on the bottom of the Atlantic, she has become a time capsule symbolizing the death of 1,500 unfortunate souls. This compelling tragedy will continue to live in our imaginations for centuries to come.